agenda of 4 papers, so we'll try to stick to time. Our first presentation is from Kim Lehrer. Over to you, 15 minutes, and then 5 minutes for our discussant, and 10 minutes for questions from the crowd.
Okay, thanks, Justin. So this is joint work with Catherine Porter, with this research assistance from Rose Page, who is also here. And it's entitled Charitable Dictators, and we look at the determinants of giving to NGOs in Uganda using an experimental setup. So what we did was we played a modified dictator game in Kampala with students, civil servants, and individuals from the private sector. And participants were basically asked to divide a sum of real money, so the equivalent of about $10 US, between themselves and a local charity chosen from a list which we provided. And then we have 2 extensions to this typical dictator game. One, a turning a blind eye treatment, which I'll describe in detail in a few minutes, and one where we asked people if they wanted to contribute any of their own funds to the charity they had selected. And what we do is we compare these results to other experimental settings and look at differences within our sample between treatment groups and between different groups of individuals, so our students, our civil servants, and our individuals from the private sector. So why do we think this is interesting? There are a growing number of experimental games that have been conducted in developing countries, though mainly these have been conducted with the poor. And what we're looking at here is really the wealthier members of the urban population who are not living in poverty, yet they do live in a developing country, and they've rarely been experimental subjects, with the exception of university students at some African universities. And we think that these individuals are interesting subjects because their decisions, their attitudes in terms of voting, charitable giving, and voluntary contributions to public goods have labor market decisions have important implications for development. So we try to sort of replicate this charitable giving in an experimental setup with a dictator game. So generally speaking, in a dictator game, participants are given an endowment, so either real or in token form, and asked to divide an amount of money between themselves and a third party. So it can be an anonymous partner, it can be a charity or another individual. And it's a very simple game, so there's no strategic interaction at all, no fear of reprisal from your partner. And so an individual who only cares about their own income or if their utility is only based on their own income would give a zero amount. And so giving any non-zero amount has been in the literature interpreted as altruism or the existence of other regarding preferences or some sort of warm glow that you would get from giving to others. And generally, in the literature, we do find that people give a positive amount in these dictator games. So there's a meta-study, a review by Engel in 2011, that reviews hundreds of dictator games and calculates the average endowment as about the average amount given as about 28% of the endowment, where 36% of dictators give nothing, about 16% give half of the endowment, and just 5% give the full amount. And so we'll come back to these figures when we talk about our results, which are a little bit different with our sample. So just skip that. So we have a subsample of students who are students at Macquarie University studying economics. In the sample, and we also have non-students, so these civil servants, Ministry of Finance personnel, and we have a private sector subsample as well, or group. And in many lab settings in developed countries, we found that these games have been conducted with students, and students typically behave quite differently from the rest of the population. And yet, so there has been comparisons within developed countries. This hasn't happened yet in developing countries, and so we think this is an interesting contribution of our work as well. Perhaps given time constraints, I'll skip this just to say that there is related literature on all of these sort of sub-treatments that we're looking at, different variants of the dictator game that have already been played. So with a charity partner, it's not novel. What we're doing here is really built on existing literature where others have played dictator games with a charity partner. This comparison with students and non-students, our contribution is that it is in a developing country where perhaps individuals may behave differently. And then we have an unearned endowment. So we're giving people these about $10 US to play with. And then we ask people if they want to contribute their own money, and that's quite unique. So normally in these setups, it's with an unearned endowment or an earned endowment where people have to sort of do a bit of work, so answer a questionnaire beforehand, so they're paid, they're told, we're giving you this for having done some work, and now you play the dictator game, and so you decide. So it's sort of earned versus unearned, but within a game setting. Here we ask people to dive into their own pockets and actually see if they want to contribute their own funds. And our blind eye treatment that I introduced at the beginning of this talk is related to these exit options, which I will discuss briefly. So we have two randomly assigned variants of the dictator game, one the standard one that I described, and then the other one where we have this turning a blind eye treatment. We have 149 participants, so we don't have a huge sample, and this was conducted in Kampala between March and April of 2013. So we have Ministry of Finance personnel, Makerere University students, and then a sort of wealthy urban participants who were clients at various cafes in Kampala, where we conducted the research. So we approached individuals who were at these cafes and asked if they wanted to participate in the research. And so the idea here is that in Uganda, many middle and upper class urban residents, both local and expatriates, frequent upscale cafes, restaurants, shopping centers, and as in other African cities, and you would pass poverty in doing so. So there is substantial poverty within Kampala that you would see. In Uganda, average income is $510 US per year, and 24% of the population live below the poverty line of $1 US per day. So this is in contrast with the people who are frequenting these cafes, where you would spend about $2 US on a cafe. So these are really like the middle upper income earners within Kampala. And we have both local and expatriates in our sample. So what we did is, to participants, we didn't tell them explicitly that they were playing a dictator game. We informed them that the research team was giving them a sum of money for their participation in our research, and that they could choose whether to give away none, some, or all of the money to a charity operating in Kampala. They received the money and then made the choice, and then they completed a questionnaire. So they received 20,000 Ugandan shillings, $10 US, in 2,000 shilling notes. They received a list of 23 charities that were operating locally in Uganda, so they were both local and international organizations. And the player chose how much to put in an envelope labeled "Take Home With You," and an envelope labeled "Leave with the research team," which would then go to the charity. The player would seal both envelopes so that we wouldn't, whether or not they were empty, so it was really anonymous what in fact they were doing, and then they would answer a short questionnaire on their age, their gender, their nationality, their education, their job, and then specifically their attitudes towards NGOs in general and towards poverty, and a ranking of the chosen charity on a scale from 1 to 10. This other sub-treatment that we put in place randomly among a subsample of the participants was what we've referred to as either the blind eye treatment or an identity treatment, where we were trying to see if people would really prefer not to be informed about this decision making that they were doing, and just turn a blind eye, perhaps in similar to the way you would turn a blind eye to poverty in your surrounding area. And so we, instead of telling them that they were playing with this game with a charity, we told them they were playing with a third party. And if they wanted to know who that third party was, they could open an envelope labeled identity, and then they would play the standard game. And if they chose not to open that envelope, then they would play the standard dictator game, but they wouldn't know who that third party was. And so, if not opened, in fact, most people then just kept the full amount. I think perhaps all kept the full amount instead of, but they could, in fact, give to the third party. And so our hypothesis here is to examine who opens the envelope and whether they give more or less when they have opted to open it or not to open it. And finally, this introduction of whether or not people want to donate their own funds in addition to the funds they've allocated from the endowment that we've given them, the 20,000 shillings. And so the puzzle of dictator games in general is that people seem more generous or altruistic than they are in real life. But of course, this relies on people's choices over a windfall gain that we've given them, which we would imagine is very different than how you would behave surrounding your own money. And so the final question of our questionnaire was, would you like to add some of your own money to the donation you've already made? If so, then you would put it in the envelope with your questionnaire when you gave it back to us. And this is only applicable to those who already donated the full 20,000 of the endowment, because if they had donated a sub-amount, then just adding to it would be really taking from the endowment. So in my last few minutes, it seems, we will skip these things and go to we have some questions related to the opinions of charities, which we think might influence how much you donate and whether or not you donate any amount. And so we asked people if they agree or disagree and how strongly on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 with 2 statements. Some people are poor through no fault of their own, and NGOs are doing good work in Uganda. And then we also have this question on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is very poor and 10 is excellent. How would you rate your chosen charity? And so we imagine, so we're testing 5 hypotheses here. The provision of an exit option, so this turning a blind eye treatment will decrease the amount donated. Allowing the amount given to exceed the endowment will increase the amount donated. An individual's ranking of the charity will be positively correlated with the amount given. The amount donated will be increasing in the perceived worthiness of the recipient. So the more you agree with a statement, poor people are poor through no fault of their own. And the amount donated will be increasing in income. And although we don't have data on income, we know whether or not you're a student, a civil servant, or in these private, or what I've called private sector individuals, but they're clients at cafes. And so we imagine that the students at this current moment are probably the poorest out of that, followed by the civil servants, and then these sort of wealthy individuals at cafes. So here's some main results from our findings. 80% of our sample gave some non-zero amount. The mean amount is just under 1/2 of the endowment, which is quite high relative to other dictator games. And almost 30% of our sample gave the total amount to the charity. And so compared to other studies, this is generally quite high. If we look by group, so by if they're in the civil service, in a student, or in this other group who was interviewed or who participated in a cafe, we see striking differences with really this other group donating significantly more than the Ministry of Finance and students. Between students and Ministry of Finance, we don't see actually huge differences in these pictures, but what we will see in the empirical results is that Ministry of Finance personnel give significantly less than students, which is really quite the opposite of what's been normally found in studies where the students are the ones giving the least amount. We divide these samples between the full sample on the left and on the right we have just the Ugandan subsample, because our expatriates are largely located in this other group. There are a few students who are also non-Ugandan, but the Ministry of Finance personnel are all Ugandans, so you might think there are differences in income or perhaps in other attitudes. And so the final column is just for the Ugandan subsample, but we see very similar results. And so here's basically our differences by treatment, so whether or not you got this blind eye treatment. And so what we see is the amount you donated is significantly less if you got the blind eye treatment, where you were given the chance not to find out who your partner was, and also you were less likely to keep you were more likely to keep the full amount if you got that identity treatment. So less likely to give away anything. And then we had some controls, and it's clear that our sample size is very limited, so we lose some power here, but we're finding that these Ministry of Finance personnel are giving significantly less than students. When we look at attitudes towards poverty and charities, in general, people's views, both Ugandan and expatriates' views of charities are quite high in Uganda. They seem to think they're doing quite good work. So most people agree or strongly agree that NGOs are doing good work in Uganda and that people are poor through no fault of their own. But when we look at the correlates of amount donated, at least for people who are poor through no fault of their own, we don't see any relationship, but actually we find a negative relationship with NGOs are doing good work. So you're donating less if you believe that NGOs are doing good work in Uganda, and that's only significant here for non-Ugandans. And so our interpretation of this finding is that, or one explanation of this finding is that people who think NGOs are doing good work in Uganda think that they're able to do so because they are already well funded, and so there's less of a need to donate to them. Although we can't test this, we didn't ask a question, but related to whether or not NGOs were adequately funded. Who gave their own funds? So not very many people. We can't estimate it empirically. Only 10 people gave a non-zero amount, though 26 people did say they did, but then didn't leave any money. So maybe they thought it was a hypothetical question. And so these are the characteristics of those individuals, but of course there's only 10 of them. So finally, to conclude, if we go back to the 5 hypotheses that we originally started with, the provision of an exit option will decrease the amount donated. We do find that, although it's no longer significant when we add quite a few controls. Given our small sample size, perhaps that's not as surprising. Allowing the amount given to exceed the endowment will increase the amount donated. It did for 10 individuals, although we haven't highlighted in green as being true because there's only 10. An individual's ranking of the charity will be positively correlated with the amount given. Actually, we find that negative result. The amount donated will be increasing in the perceived worthiness of the recipient. I didn't show you, but a one-sided t-test does show that this is significant. And then the amount donated will be increasing in income, and this is perhaps the strongest finding here, that students are actually the ones who give more than, statistically significantly more than the Ministry of Finance personnel, who we assume are actually higher earners right now. So I'll just conclude with that. Thank you.
All right, and we have our discussant before we take questions. Po, over to you.
Thank you for the very interesting research and presentation. Okay, cool. So I just have a few questions and I guess comments. So in the paper, you suggested that maybe very few people gave or donated any money out of their own pocket, while some do give the full amount, the 20,000 Ugandan shilling. You wonder if that's because players or participants thought that that amount was enough. So I was wondering if you've tried to vary this amount, for example, by lowering the value of this windfall to below 20,000 and see if the 20,000 is indeed the upper bound. And then you also, in the paper, suggested that perhaps players or participants considered windfall very differently from their own income, and therefore having your result that people are more willing to give the windfall but not their own money. Then I wonder if you've, again, tried to increase the value of this windfall to above 20,000 and see if perhaps there's a threshold level of windfall as such that the participants start treating this windfall and income equally. The third point is, I see that you do have some information about the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics of your participants, and I wonder if you also control for whether any of your participants has donated before, either to any or perhaps the same charity in your treatment when they know the identity of the charity. So perhaps you can then, it might be an interesting exercise to see if past charitable behavior is predictive of their donation decision in your game. And finally, I wonder if you could provide some context as to the types of charity work that you have on your list, because I wonder what's the degree of variation in the type of charitable work done, and whether that kind, for example, charities targeted specifically at children tend to receive more donations than other types of charities. So I thought it'd be interesting, but thank you very much for a very good presentation.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Please.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I have one question and one remark maybe. First of all, it's a pity that your sample is so small. I wonder whether that's because of the budget or whether people refuse to participate, and then if the latter is the case, whether this refusal differed across civil servants and students. That's my question, and my comment relates to the motivation of your paper. So you motivated partly by saying, well, these people are in a relatively good position, considering the overall wealth in the society. So this may affect their giving back. And it may be different than in Western societies where poverty may not be so blatant. But I think there is another part of the context which is really important, and that is that even though these people are in a good position, they're also facing many family obligations, and this may be very important for civil servants which have a stable employment, which probably are also a bit older than students. So because of social norms, they are the ones who are always giving to others, nieces, nephews, etc. And students are mostly on the receiving end. Those are the individuals receiving money from uncles, right? So I wonder whether this part of the context that's also very different between developing and developed countries may influence your results, and whether you can, in some way or another, control for that.
Just one quick clarification about what's the reason why you choose this kind of 3 different samples about students, civil servants, and is there any likelihood that there is a kind of overlap between civil servants and the wealthy, or how do you treat that?
Okay, why don't you get the last word, Kim?
Okay.
You've got a few minutes, so.
Thanks. Thank you all for the comments. I think I'll start with Poe's comments. Thanks very much. They're very interesting. The first thing, so we didn't lower or increase the windfall. I think it would be very interesting to do to see if that does change it. I would be surprised if, I mean, we suggested as a possibility that people just think 20,000 is enough to give to a charity and therefore don't donate anymore. It's not a very large sum. I mean, it's about $10 US. So I would imagine it's unlikely to change unless we really increased it quite a bit, which we didn't have the funds for. But I think it is an interesting research question to look into. I don't remember actually if we've looked at whether players donated before. I think we have, and we didn't find differential results, but should go back and take a look at that. And then in terms of the charities, so I should say that these 23 charities were selected based on other research that Catherine and I have done in Uganda, where we asked people to there were some funds, and people were sort of playing a game for a charity as well, and they could choose any charity. And these are the top 23 that people had listed. And so they vary, but they're mainly within for children and poverty alleviation, and the main ones that most people selected were related to children. So that was I think the first thing. In terms of our sample size, it's quite limited. It was strictly due to the budget. So actually, I think very few people refused, even in the cafes. If it was because they were coming in and leaving. And so when we approached people and could actually explain, I don't think anyone actually refused to participate. In terms of the civil servants and family obligations, so we've thought about this as well because we heard it quite a bit while we were there. We don't, especially to the question of, we asked them if you've donated to a charity, and most people would say no, but we give to, my housekeeper's son, we're paying for his education, or my cousin's something. And so I agree with you. I imagine that it's much more important for civil servants and for these individuals, both expats and locals who are a bit wealthier than it is for students. Although I'm not sure it would explain all of our results here because again, it's just this 20,000 shillings. And so, I mean, if they really think they're going to take it and then give to a cousin or an uncle, maybe, but I would be surprised. And then the last thing, why these three groups? So the students was because this is really in typically with a sample that people have researched in developing and developed countries, so sort of as a control to see what students were doing. Civil servants, we were really interested in sort of altruistic behavior within Uganda, and so we were also interested originally in public goods provision, and so sort of looking at how the civil servants or those who are supposed to be engaged in sort of in contributing to the economic development of the country behaved, and then we wanted to reach the wealthier sort of middle class to look at their attitudes, because this is something that hasn't been studied, and so one way of doing it was through these cafes, but there would have been other methods as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay. Impressive discipline on the time. Thank you for setting a good record. So we have Po Yin Wong from University of Maryland, Returns to Capital and Ability, a natural experiment in Aceh, Indonesia.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So let me I'll give you the basic idea behind this research. In a developing country's context, understanding the returns to capital, which is possibly constrained, and the returns to human capital or innate ability is extremely important. However, to empirically assess the respective contribution of these factors is often very challenging, because capital is likely endogenous with respect to the innate ability and other unobserved owner characteristics. One way to get around this is to conduct a randomized control trial in which you're absolutely certain that the capital assigned is exogenous. An alternative is to use a natural experiment, and this is what I do. I use a natural experiment, taking advantage of a natural disaster that you might recall, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. It wiped out 94%, almost all of the productive capital, which is fishing boats, in the province of Aceh, in which the main economic activity is fishing. Among the surviving fishermen, there was an infusion of 8 boats, as the NGOs came in with a supply of boats to give out without coordinating their efforts, and therefore most observers believed that that was effectively a plausibly exogenously assignment of aid capital. I take this setting to explore the following questions. First, does this transfer of capital aid in kind increase overall productivity among these fishermen? Then, what are the returns to physical capital and inherent ability among these fishermen in the short run, 2 years, medium run, 4 years, and then 7 years, slightly longer run? Specifically, I ask, what is the return to an additional meter of an exogenously assigned aid boat? And then finally, I explore whether the more productive fishermen pre-tsunami continue to outperform their peers after the disaster, post-tsunami, controlling for the assignment of these 8 boats. Now, this research contributes to a growing literature that looks at the returns to capital among small-scale productive activities in developing countries. A lot of these studies give out capital stock randomly to small, medium, micro enterprises, and they find that there are positive effects on growth. However, there is heterogeneity in the returns to capital in terms of, for example, entrepreneurial ability and initial levels of capital. A more recent study by Fuchs-Apples looks at the more nuanced question of whether the returns to giving these small, medium enterprises cash differs from giving them, say, an equipment or a machinery, something in kind. Standard investment models suggest that if a firm is constrained, alleviating that constraint should see results in growth, regardless of the form of credit given. However, this study finds that the impact of cash is lower, and they term this effect the flypaper effect. That is, the cash doesn't stick as much in the business as if compared to giving these firms capital in kind. My research builds on this literature by using a setting in which capital is first taken away by the natural disaster, which normally we can't do, and then reassigned through an aid program. And I compared the returns not just to the physical capital, but also to returns, but also compared it with returns to inheritability over time. As a preview, I find that returns to physical capital, which is fishing boats in this case, and the inheritability of these fishermen, which I measure with pre-tsunami productivity, are both positive. However, I find that the returns to aid boat diminish over time, with the returns in 2012, 7 years after the disaster, is a quarter lower than that in 2009, while the returns to inheritability increases. In 2012, the returns is 2.6 percentage points higher than that in 2007. In Aceh, among my sample of fishermen, there is variation in terms of the boats fishermen own. They range anywhere from about 6 meters long to a big boat 16 meters long. They vary in terms of the weight and the engine capacity as well. Although the majority of the fishermen pre-tsunami and also the types of aid boats given out, the smaller types, around 7 meters long, 3 to 4 meters long. 7.5 meters, 6 to 7 meters long. Visually, this is what a small boat would be. And then this is a medium operation, and then this would be a larger boat. So this Indian Ocean tsunami was devastating. It wiped out 50% of the population and almost all of the productive capital, which is the fishing boats. Only under 6% survived. Then, as I mentioned, that there was a supply of 8 boats afterwards. They're mostly small boats. They're of very poor quality because there was a rush to give out these boats. They're poorly made, they don't last very long, etc. And the point of this slide is to show that whether somebody applied for an aid boat and whether the fishermen had survived the pre-tsunami boat does not matter for whether you received an aid boat or not, which is to say that it was a mess. The distribution was believably exogenous. The data that I used has 4 waves. There's one wave. The baseline survey was conducted 6 months after the tsunami with retrospective information on pre-tsunami characteristics and fishing revenue and output. And then the survey team came in 3 times after the tsunami in 2007, 2009, and then 2012. This is the study area. It was conducted mostly along coastal fishing villages in this province of Aceh in Indonesia, where the tsunami hit. The key to measuring the difficulty in measuring inheritability is how do I measure it? So I use this basically total factor productivity measure by taking the pre-tsunami fishing revenue and I predict that with the type of the boat, the length of the boat, and also the man hours in the fishing production, and then an interaction of the boat length and the hours, so which represents the fuel cost, and then whatever remains to be unpredicted by these factor outputs, and I take the residuals as my measure of inheritability or pre-tsunami productivity. My main regressions look at the post-tsunami boat length, which is representative of the productive capital of these fishermen, and also the post-tsunami fishing revenue. I find that the impact of productivity, the pre-tsunami productivity measure that I showed, in 2007, at first, it's negative in terms of post-tsunami boat length, but then it increases and it becomes positive. And I see a similar trend in when I look at post-tsunami revenue as the outcome. However, in terms of aid-boat length, we find that in 2007, the impact of an additional meter of aid boat is associated with a 0.69 meter in the post-tsunami boat. This impact is non-monotonic as it increases in 2009, it tops in 2009, and in 2012 it eventually diminishes. And similarly, we see the same non-monotonic trend in the fishing revenue. This is an IB estimation in which instead of in which I use the aid boat length as the instrument for the current boat length. And again, I find that the impact of productivity starts out negative and becomes positive, although I don't see that increasing trend here. In terms of boat length, I still see the non-monotonic trend in terms of post-tsunami revenue. And then finally, this shows that among the people who have lost their pre-tsunami boats, both the pre-tsunami boat length and the aid boat length they received is predictive of their productive capital in the last wave available, while for the people who survived their boats, giving them an aid boat doesn't seem to matter at all for their ultimate productive capacity. What matters seems to be what they had before the tsunami. So this is basically saying if I was a big boat owner, you give me a small boat, eventually I will end up having a big boat. For the people who survived the fishing boats. But if I lost my boat, I used to be a small boat owner, what the boat that you give me on aid matters as well as what I had before. Am I too fast? I don't know. Okay, so the conclusion is, in this research, just to recap, I examined how these fishermen rearranged themselves after suffering from this shock, the natural disaster, in their productive capital. I evaluate the impact of a plausibly exogenously assigned capital, the fishing boats provided in kind, on their recovery. I show that the adaptability of these fishermen on their recovery is driven both by their pre-tsunami productivity or inherent ability, which varies across fishermen, as well as the capital provided on aid. However, I find that the returns to aid capital becomes weaker over time, as we saw in the non-monotonic trend from 07, 09, and 2012. And so it shows that the redistributive effects of these aid capital on productivity is temporary. And that is the more productive fishermen pre-tsunami continue to be more productive, post-tsunami, and the less productive ones continue to be less productive. So the objective of this aid program might not be to bridge the gap of productivity across these fishermen. But if it was, then the redistributive effects are very small. If I have time, then I can show you that the key the identification strategy in this research is that the assignment of boat aid is really quasi-random. And so I checked that the receipt of the aid boat, as well as the characteristic, which is the length of the aid boat, is uncorrelated with pre-tsunami characteristics. So the older fishermen were not more likely to get an aid boat or less likely. Whether the fisherman was less or more connected to the community were not less or more likely to get an aid boat or a longer boat. And whether you were more productive before the tsunami, again, did not matter for whether you received an aid boat or not. And so by trusting that the aid boat assigned is really exogenous, we can use that to estimate the returns to capital. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Po. It was a very interesting paper, and I think a very interesting topic to understand after a natural disaster or any type of shock, a conflict you can imagine. How can foreign aid help rebuild an existing market or an existing industry? And so I think it really has implications for really a large variety of different kind of natural disasters or human-made disasters with potential to look at the aid impacts. I have a couple questions really about the estimation strategy, but the paper has a nice theoretical section at the beginning that sort of talks about the productivity or how the production function in fishing, which Poe didn't have very much time to go over here. But then I got confused between that theoretical section and then sort of the link with the estimation. So nowhere in that did I see boat length, and so I don't know, how boat length in fishing really affects how much catch you can get or how that would be, and why I should think of it in a linear form, and why these small differences, if the 8 boats are mostly that smaller type, if half a meter or 1 meter, how that changes my productivity. So I would want a bit more understanding on the link between those two. In terms of the estimation, there's also a lot going on in the estimation, and there's sort of sample selection in 3 parts here. So in the paper it details selection into applying for an A boat or not, which was sort of shown here. I think that's pretty clear that it seems quite random, but then there's also selection into or changes from fishing. So you were originally a fisherman and then you switch out of the industry, I think. And then also just attrition from the sample, which seems quite high. And so there's some controls for that, and they seem, well, I'm just not convinced by some of them. So there's a bit of weighting based on something that is a bit unclear. So I would just go back and look at that, because the attrition seems quite substantial, and I'm not sure which type of fishermen, if it's really those low productivity ones or those who didn't get an aid boat, who are just exiting the fishing sector and then not in the analysis. And the other part of the analysis here is all done on revenue, and the article mentions that they focus on revenue instead of catch, because catch is much more variable. So I was wondering why that was the case, and if revenue is just asked as a lump sum, how much did you earn from fishing, or if it's calculated based on catch, and therefore why it would have so much less variation. And also the link between if it's really how much you sold, that revenue or profit, versus smaller fishermen who might keep some more for feeding their family. And so if there's a link between boat size and that, and with revenue you're sort of missing it, but with catch you would keep it. So just a kind of a few questions with the empirics and the link to the theory, but a very nice paper. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, questions. We got one right beside you here, and then one down here.
Is it on? I was wondering if you have any, so I was curious about how the folks who were given small boats then moved themselves back up to big boats. Do you have any information on or data on whether that was through transfers? So did the folks who were given a big boat but had a small boat sort of switch? Did the folks who were given a small boat pay them to sort of to switch the boats, or did it happen through regular markets, right?
My question is more on a broader interpretation of the paper. From the very beginning, it seems you try to steer the paper in the direction of something about how can we look at the productivity of capital installment or basically investment. And in this way, I don't know if the paper can say something exactly on that, in the sense that here, what you're observing basically is rebuilding capital that was already there. So we know that capital was productive. If you believe that, we made decision and people were productive and that investment is a positive net present value, then for sure rebuilding should bring benefit. The big question would be, if I have to choose among a number of projects that I don't know under uncertainty, then which one will be productive? It's a different thing. Now it's just basically rebuilding. So I don't think that the paper speaks very much to this kind of question.
Okay, maybe I'll jump in with one. I think my first question was actually the same as the first question. I mean, is this about investment and accumulating capital after the tsunami, or is this a reallocation of the aid boats? Second, though, and it was clearer in the abstract, but I think implicit in what you said is the idea that ex-ante productivity is a stronger determinant or better explains outcomes than do the aid allocations. And when you have two explanatory variables that are in different units, different concept, I mean, TFP and capital you know, I'm just kind of curious what it means. Yes, one had more stars or had a different, you know, time trajectory, but how should I make sense of the statement that productivity is a bigger determinant of outcomes than the capital stock?
Yes, thank you for an interesting paper. My comment is a bit related to a previous comment that talks about how you frame the paper, how you put it in literature. I think you have a very neat situation to explore how an initial investment may or may not lead to takeoff of some households, because now you focus on this difference between high ability and low ability, so those who had a boat and were very productive before and those who didn't. But I think that the interesting variation, in my opinion, is among the low ability households, those who didn't have a boat. You can actually see whether this initial investment in a boat, giving them a boat, leads to a takeoff. What I see from your results is that it has a short-term effect, but not a very long-term effect. But you could explore variation within these households to see whether for some households it has a long-term effect.
Yeah, just 2 points. First was to follow up a little bit on the 2 comments about the boat size and interpreting. You're sort of saying an additional meter, and I just wondered, is it an additional meter, or are there like 4 boat types and you move sort of, it's not a linear process, it's like you move from a little boat to a medium boat to a bigger boat. So would that help with interpreting the results and how meaningful they are? And the second point was just to ask about, you know, the capital stock was destroyed, but also the labor stock was, you know, not to make it sound too dreadful and economicsy, but, you know, lots of people died, and so there are fewer fishermen as well as no boats, and I'm just interested to know how that affects your context for explaining the results. Thanks.
So Mike, actually it's more of a comment, and perhaps you might have some insights to it. So Sri Lanka was also severely affected by tsunami, so my question is based on what I experienced. Could it be possible that the survivors of tsunami actually were better off after the tsunami as a result of all the aid that came into the country? So that in essence, like tsunami was like a disguised blessing. So part of what you observe, could it be talking about low ability versus high ability, would it be possible that it would not have happened unless tsunami aid did come in? It's not that the people essentially improved, but they just have a lot more resources. I mean, people who survived, of course, have a lot more resources at their disposal which were not previously available.
We've asked you to remember a lot already, so why don't we give you a chance to, I always say the advantage of a long list of questions is that you can pick and choose and no one will remember which ones you skipped, but please.
Okay, thank you for all the questions and comments. Okay, so first of all, I guess Kim's. And also, so you asked about boat length, and also some other people did. So the idea is that I have a number of metrics to measure the quality of the boat. I have the weight, the length, the engine power, the type. And all of these are correlated. So for a clean estimation, I have to pick one. And length is the one that I pick because I believe that it has the least measurement error. And it is not a perfect measure of how productive a boat is, but it is what I have. And so that boat length relates to the capital K in the theoretical model. And the theta in the theoretical model is the ability, so the function, I have it in the paper that the production function of fishing is production fishing. The production of fishing is a function of the inherent ability and the physical capital. In terms of attrition, so attrition from the sample is taken care of in terms of checking the pre-tsunami characteristics among the people who quit the sample and the people who stayed, and I checked that they are not systematically different. in terms of people who stay fishing or quit fishing. So I restrict the estimation sample to be the panel of people who stay fishing throughout, and I use inverse probability weights to control for or to test for whether this selection matters, and I've shown that it does not. And then I use actually a revenue-weighted composite output instead of the catch, because again of the measurement issue with catch versus revenue. So it is really a revenue-weighted output because of different kinds of fish as well. So I use revenue to weigh all these different types of fish to make it into one output instead of two pieces of small fish versus one lobster. So this is the way I use it as an outcome. I don't have information on whether the boats were just whether the fishermen just switch boats with each other or through the market, but it is really in the data, but anecdotal evidence suggests that the boat market does exist and that you can sell the boats. If I get an 8-boat, I don't like it, I sell it on the market and somebody will buy it. So it is believed to be a market for boats. Okay, so maybe I didn't make my point clear, Justin, but you're right that you can't compare the returns to inherent ability with returns to physical capital because they're of different units. So the exercise really is to compare within the productivity. What is the impact of inherent ability in 2007? Compare that with the returns in 2009 and then in 2012. So and I see that the impact increases. Then within 8-boat, impact in 2007, 2009, 12. And then I see that, so it is really that within comparison, but I should have made that more clear. Loss of labor, yes, a lot of people died. So, wait, okay, how should I frame it? Okay, so the whole panel consists of people who survived, right? So people who were there, people who were there after. I cannot control for the manpower they put on the boat, so the quality of the crew members, for example, I wasn't able to control for that because of the lack of information from the data. Yes. And then, unless you believe that the people who survived are the fitter people, and then so I have to make the assumption that the exposure to the disaster and the survival is random, and so that the loss is not impacting biasing my results. The lower ability, okay, I guess I can pick and choose, and then no, I'll think about the other questions and I'll get back to you. Thank you. Okay.
All right, this is just unprecedented discipline in terms of time. So we head now to Andreas Fuchs, who's presenting, I think, the most creative title of the session, Apples and Dragonfruits.
I don't know. How do I get rid of this? Oh, no, okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, apples and dragonfruits, the determinants of aid and other forms of state financing from China to Africa. This is joint work with Austin Strange from Harvard University, Brad Parks and Mike Tierney from the College of William and Mary, and Axel Dreher, who's also at Heidelberg University. So it's part of a larger project on Chinese aid to Africa, so let's get started. So non-traditional donors, and by this we mean donors operating outside the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, provide a growing share of global development finance. And to get at hard figures is almost impossible. So a paper from the Center for Global Development estimated non-DAC aid to be out of 11 to 42 billion a year. And so already the range shows you that it's really difficult to come to a good estimate. So the problem here is most non-traditional donors do not participate in the international finance reporting schemes, so OECD creditor reporting system or the IATI. In this paper, we look at China, and we believe that China is of particular interest, not only because it's most likely the largest non-DAC donor, but also because its aid activities are particularly opaque. At the same time, there are many accusations of Western policymakers of solely self-interested goals. And what you hear about Chinese aid is, in quotation marks, they exploit natural resources, they only support rogue states, they threaten debt sustainability, they violate environmental and labor standards. Others believe that China is actually better in providing development aid, and it's better suited to Africa's needs. They provide the infrastructure. They are speedier, they are less bureaucratic. So there are these contrasts, and so popular perception and also some case studies provide quite a dark picture. So Naeem brings it to a point. He calls China a rogue donor that only supports countries with bad governments, exploits natural resources of the country they aid, provide financing only to buy political friends. And this quote, I think, summarizes China couldn't care less about the long-term well-being of the countries that they aid. In some previous work, we ran an econometric analysis on China's aid allocation, but at that time we only had the number of aid projects provided by China to particular countries. And so what we found is China's aid is independent of institutional characteristics. None of the institutional indicators became significant. We found that Chinese aid is shaped by politics and commercial interests as expected, but no surprise. We know that this is the case for Western donors as well. And interestingly, we didn't find a robust effect of natural resource endowment, which is really in stark contrast with a lot of case study evidence. Problem is we had to use limited data because we relied on only the number of projects from yearbooks, and interestingly, China stopped publishing this item in its yearbooks in 2006. So after 2006, you don't get much official information. So the puzzle is that the prevailing wisdom is that non-Western donors are less altruistic than Western ones, but this is not really supported by the existing empirical evidence. So what explains this difference? And so this slide basically summarizes our argument. So you see an apple and a dragonfruit. And so when you have a first look, both really look similar. So similar color, but I don't know whether you had a dragonfruit in the past. When you would cut it into two pieces, you would see from the inside both look really different. And so applied to our question, we believe that when you make comparisons, you should be aware of what you are comparing. So if you are comparing Western ODA flows, you have to construct something that's equivalent to in the Chinese case. And we say that this puzzle is at least partially a result of inadequate attention to different types of official finance, and China's lack to visibly separate their aid budget from other official flows make them look less discriminate than donors from the OECD. So what we do in the paper is we compare the motive driving ODA-like flows and less concessional flows, so-called OF flows, other official flows. And what do we expect? ODA-like flows are more concessional, so they are more likely to be used to buy policy concessions in foreign affairs. By contrast, less concessional flows, OF, are closer to market conditions, and we would expect them to be driven by economic interests. So, and this summarizes these hypotheses. So first, ODA-like flows are driven more by political interests. Second, OF-like flows are driven more by commercial interests. And the third hypothesis says Chinese OF-like flows will favor recipients with good institutions. Again, same argument. This is market-driven, so we expect that they care about repayment, but this we don't expect for ODA-like flows in line with China's principle of non-interference into internal affairs. So problem again, as mentioned earlier, there's no comprehensive official data. China treats its aid activities like a state secret, and what are the possible reasons? What they say is low administrative capacity. Then they might also try to avoid pressure from other recipient countries to increase aid to the levels of their peers. There's some domestic criticism in China, and the last also is important, there's a disinterest to comply with Western standards. So we collected data on Chinese aid projects from open sources. So part of them are media sources, then reports by ministries, NGO reports, and created a crowdsourcing platform. And maybe in the Q&A we can also discuss a bit more how we did this. But we tried to follow the money to avoid double counting, had a lot of cross checks, and and through the crowdsourcing platform we are constantly updating the data. So definitions, I think, are important to make Chinese aid and Western aid comparable. We use OECD definitions as far as this is possible. So ODA, I don't think I have to go into this. Then OF is all other official flows, loans and grants that do not, that are either not intended, they either do not intend the promotion of economic development or that are not sufficiently concessional. And then we have a third category, what we call OF, official finance vague, and these are all the flows where we just do not have enough information to classify them either as ODA-like or OF-like. So this is just an example. When you go online on china.aiddata.org, you can get all the information and you can have a look. So in the end, our database contains 1,511 official projects in 50 African countries in these three categories. We do not look at Chinese FDI flows, we do not look at military aid, and in our analysis we keep all projects that are at least at the commitment stage. What does this mean? We exclude all projects that are non-binding, that are just pledges. The aggregate financial value is $73 billion US dollars over this 2000-2011 period. So this is a map just to give you an impression. So as you can see, most Chinese official finance goes to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Ghana. And then there are 4 white spots that they haven't received any Chinese aid over this period, and these are those countries that recognize Taiwan. So a couple of words on flow types. So on the left you see the number of projects, and on the right you see the amount in billions of constant US dollars, and in terms of project numbers, grants dominate and ODA-like flows. And if you look at the amounts on the right, it's loans that dominate, and OF, other official flows, where we also include these vague flows. So how do we proceed? We follow the aid allocation literature that usually groups donor interest into recipient needs, merit, so aid should be given to countries with good institutions, commercial self-interests and political self-interests. So how do they apply? When we now take the literature on Western donors, how do they apply to Chinese aid activities? Recipient needs, at least according to Chinese rhetoric, might play a role. Merit, this we wouldn't expect, as China says that they follow the principle of non-interference into internal affairs. Commercial interests and political interests obviously are expected to play a role. Now our empirical test. So we compare the determinants of China's ODA-like projects with less concessional flows of official finance. And what we also do is we compare the allocation of grants with the allocation of loans, which is basically following the same argument that we expect a different allocation behavior for these more concessional loans compared to market-driven flows. We use the PPML approach, as we have a lot of zeros in the data set. So although almost all countries in Africa receive at least some Chinese assistance, In particular years, we also have a lot of zeros. And the dependent variable is then the amount of China's development finance in constant 2009 dollars. In the paper, we also use project numbers, but for the sake of time in the presentation, I will focus on the amounts. So, independent variables, how do we explain the motives? So as measures of recipient need, we use, as usual, per capita income. Then a measure for natural disasters, so the number of victims from natural disasters. We use population size. Measure of regime type, we use the usual Polit2 measure. Then for China's geopolitical interests, we have two measures. So the usual voting alignment in the United Nations General Assembly. So it is the share of votes in which a particular recipient country votes in line with China. And we have a dummy variable indicating whether a country recognizes Taiwan in a particular year. Measures of China's commercial interests, we have mainly exports and natural resource endowments. And then we use control variables. First is a dummy whether a country has English as an official language. So this is basically to take account of one potential problem of our data gathering strategy. So our searches were based on searches in English and Mandarin, but obviously this may lead to a lower probability that we detect flows in French or Portuguese, in French or Portuguese speaking countries. Then we control for duck aid, and we add time dummies. So these are our results. So let me start with the first hypothesis, and this was that ODA-like flows are more likely to be driven by political interest than other official flows. And this is what we more or less find here. So our political variables do not play a role. There's no statistically significant effect when we look at total official finance, but when we just look at those flows that we could identify as being like OECD-defined official development assistance, so aid in the strict sense, we find all three measures to be statistically significant with the expected sign. So the closer the voting alignment with China, the more aid flows into particular countries, and the same is the case if a country changes its voting behavior in China's favor. Less aid goes to country recognizing Taiwan. And then for OOF and vague flows, we even find a negative coefficient, unexpected negative coefficient of one of the three, and the other two are statistically insignificant. Then let's turn to commercial interests. Here we find a positive effect for natural resources, but when we then just look at what we in the OECD would also call official development assistance, the effect disappears and becomes statistically insignificant, but remains positive in the OOF vague regressions. And finally, third hypothesis on institutions. Here we do not find a statistically significant effect for ODA-like flows in line with China's principle of non-interference into internal affairs. But when we then look at OOF, yes, here we see, at least at the 10% level, a positive effect of democracy. And this is what we would expect, because China cares for good institutions with these flows, because they care about repayment. So conclusions, ODA-like flows and less concessional flows from China to Africa serve different purposes. ODA-like flows and grants are mainly used for foreign policy goals, less concessional flows more to promote China's exports and access to natural resources. And this is how we explain the perception of China as being a rogue donor. And we have to pay attention when we make comparisons. So coming back to Naeem's characterization of China as a rogue donor, so access to natural resources, no support for aid strictly speaking, international alliances, yes, We find a link here, but this is not exclusively the case for China. We know from the empirical aid literature that the same is the case for the US and other countries. And finally, the claim that China was just supporting countries with bad governments, and here's no empirical support for ODA-like flows. So China, at least when it comes to aid, strictly speaking, does not seem to care about institutions. And this is just my last slide, an outlook. So now we work on the subnational allocation of aid. And thanks.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Andreas. Very interesting paper. I think it's timely in terms of the news, at least sitting in Washington, D.C., there's controversy over the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and whether, the Americans wanting to opt out of it, and all this concern about China using its aid to influence geopolitics. So a very timely topic. I think it's a really nice paper in terms of kind of trying to tamp down on some of that scaremongering around the use of Chinese development assistance, and well written and interesting to read. But all the nice things out of the way, let me go into the to the rest of the comments. Okay, so 3 substantive comments. One kind of a detail thing, actually. What do the coefficients mean? Just as a reader, I am going to confess, never estimated a Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood model. That's fine, you give good reasons for doing it, but it means that I don't really know how to read the coefficients. So I'd like to see sentences like the coefficient of 1.9 implies that voting with China in the UN General Assembly increases anticipated ODA from China by some amount that I can interpret, and I could never get my head around that. And then what would be nice, since you're rooted in and citing repeatedly all of this US, the Alicina dollar type literature that's done similar exercises with DAC donors, it'd be nice to then put the coefficients side by side and as much as you can to say, are the Chinese more or less politically driven, more or less sensitive to poverty or GDP, whatever it may be. 1, 2, I think actually the presentation was a little bit different than the paper in this respect. I read through the paper and I kind of felt like you had these hypotheses, but ODA versus the non-concessional stuff will be more driven by politics, and the non-concessional stuff will be more driven by the business type variables, and we confirmed everything, and I get to the end and I look at the tables, I just felt like the tables, it didn't jump out at me as much as it did in the narrative. This is the results for the number of projects, and what I think we're supposed to see is different coefficients between these 2 columns, and when you kind of scan through for the differences, it doesn't, the only one that kind of jumps out confuses me a lot then about the estimator that, get a coefficient of 0.036, which is significant at the 10% level, but the standard error is 0.07, and so then I started to get a little bit lost. That may be my misunderstanding of pseudo-maximum likelihood. It works a little better in your defense for the quantity of aid received, so there are some things where these differences jump out. It'd be nice to see the test just in the tables, that comparing the coefficients across equations, but there are still others, like recognizing Taiwan. There's a difference in the number of stars, but the point estimates are really very similar here. And then the last point, just wondering about the direction of causation here. Chinese investment, for instance, and natural resource depletion, and kind of the paper is framed as if natural resource attracts Chinese investment, but it seems like with the measure you're using, things could be going, if the Chinese investment is in natural resource extraction, I'm not sure which way this is going. These aid allocation papers typically kind of duck the causal inference question, and that, that's the aid impact papers have to worry about all the causal inference, but some of your statements sound pretty causy, if I can make up a word. And so my last thought is just brainstorming 2 contradictory impulses. Again, these are not your contradictions, these are my own contradictions, just thinking up ideas, but one would be trying to do something like using exogenous natural resource price interacted with endowments and really try to identify causal effects in the allocation equation. and the other would be to go a different direction. And this is really not your paper, but just places to go is, are you kind of building the first stage for an IV for a paper on the impacts of Chinese aid? I don't quite yet see what the IV is, because most of the variables are things that could be in any growth equation, but it would be curious to see if you can come up with them. The literature would appreciate you a lot if you did. Let me stop there. Oh. Why don't you field your, maybe, sure.
I just have a question on the claim that you have that the Chinese aid is not related to institution. Have you tried other measure of institution other than polity, for instance, to try to double check if it's a problem with the measure of institution? And my other worry would be about in the multicolority of the variable of interest that you have in your model. If countries that are maybe weaker institutions are more likely to vote like China, or to have maybe more resource-intensive countries. I'm just wondering if maybe you're not picking up institutions because of multicolority and maybe the measure of that, if you have done some other check for that.
Thank you. So this is a really impressive effort, and I've seen parts of this before. So this is great to sort of see how you've sort of now using the data. So I should maybe know this, and maybe I've just missed it even in this presentation, but the sort of relative importance of ODA and other official financial flows. Because at the moment we are just sort of seeing coefficients that are difficult to interpret. I have to agree there with Justin. So maybe it's all terribly statistically significant, but if Chinese support is a lot in these other official flows, which do work very differently, then that be, it's important to sort of know how much higher they are than what you define as ODA, yeah? But that's not to diminish your effort of sort of, because you're really truly the first people who've got a data set like this. So then my second suggestion for this paper is that, okay, there's a huge aid literature on aid allocation, and they all look at need, merit, and self-interest. But hardly any paper sort of says how relatively important these things are. And other social scientists use, it doesn't seem to be very popular with economists, but partial R-squares, for example, to sort of just try and get at something to sort of say how important these things are. And there's an excellent paper by Höfler and Outram who do exactly that, so you could have a look at that.
So when you think of the most resource-rich countries, I shouldn't even surmise. I think that the prediction that we should expect from the stereotypical view is that China's going to be investing a lot in countries that are exporting natural resources to China, which might not necessarily be a resource-rich country like South Africa. If anything, these would be the poorest countries, maybe which don't export a lot of natural resources in volume, and where maybe the other foreign companies have stayed away from. So I wonder if you could use exports to China, or look at specifically which minerals China is importing from Africa. I don't know if it's uniform across everything being produced there.
50 billion public. So who are their reasons here about the effects and the motives of writing OLED? But still, it's somehow an unfair comparison. So they are probably more likely to be compared to private activities from the West. So if it's, say, an SOE, Chinese SOE, carrying out a certain project. I like the idea to look at partial R squares. And of course, I like the idea to look at the effects, the development impact. This is what we finally, in the end, all care about. But I think it's a bit too early to do it for China. So because our data set starts in 2000, and I think that's 2005, we really see really, really big amounts. So to having a growth regressions, and we all know about the problems of the 8 growth literature, I would be at least be a bit cautious. So yeah, but thanks a lot.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the impact of Gavi on vaccination rates. And this is a paper together with 3 other colleagues, also at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. For those of you who are not familiar, Gavi is the single largest aid program on vaccination in the world. So for the 75 countries that qualified for Gavi, 75 developing countries, Gavi accounts for more than half of vaccination spending across these countries, something like $7 billion in the first decade of this century. And just a couple of months ago, Angela Merkel gathered donors in Germany to pledge again on a replenishment of Gavi, and I think they raised something like $9.5 billion over the next 5 years. So big and growing. We are going to be looking at the impact of Gavi on a very kind of not very far downstream outcome, not looking all the way down to child mortality or economic growth, but just on what its immediate impact, we would argue, is supposed to be, which is increasing vaccination rates. All right. Clarification needed as an opening kind of caveat. Gavi does lots of things, but fundamentally 2 things, I think. And one of them sort of is to deliver a big global public good. Those of you who are familiar are going to be familiar with the advanced market commitment. They provide this kind of demand-side incentive to develop new vaccines. So the pneumococcal vaccine there's a big argument there, but possibly developed to do the incentives that Gavi put in place. The vaccine might not have existed if it weren't for Gavi. And if we can't, all countries benefit from that now. We benefit from that now. We're not evaluating that in this paper. This is about what Gavi does with most of its money, which is then buy vaccines and give them at subsidized prices to developing countries. So I picked Tanzania because I do work there just to stand in for transfers to individual countries. Giving vaccines to countries, what does it achieve? If you go, as kind of our benchmark claims, if you go to the Gavi website, you'll see, I think, some bold claims very carefully worded. Since 2000, Gavi has prevented approximately 6 million future deaths. And that sounds funny, but there's a good reason for that. Hepatitis B, which is one of the things that Gavi is helping vaccinate against, will kill you in adulthood. You get vaccinated as a child, so it's not a nonsensical statement. The question is one I would argue about causal attribution. And then 440 million additional children immunized. Now, the language is careful about how much causal attribution goes on there, but it is under, Gavi's impact on the website. Okay, so what do we want to do in this paper? I think our contribution is can be divided up into 3 parts. First and foremost, we just want to provide an independent measure of Gavi's causal effect. There have been a couple attempts to do this early on for one specific vaccine, DPT, in the Lancet, and then an evaluation Gavi commissioned. We're also going to use that as a lens into this kind of broader issue in the economics literature about the fungibility of aid, and specifically of in-kind health aid, is giving vaccines, crowding out other spending on vaccines. Big literature on that. And then lastly, we're in the foreign aid session. There's a large literature on the impact of aid. A large cross-country literature has just been kind of preoccupied with the question of the impact of aid on economic growth. But a lot of aid is not directed, really focused on the question of economic growth, and has, you know, health outcomes in mind, and we want to kind of evaluate health aid on its own terms. Even people, you know, outspoken development pundits like Angus Deaton and Bill Easterly, who are very skeptical of the impact of aid in general, tend to be quite optimistic about the impact of health aid. So this seems like a good testing ground. All right, if I don't manage to get to the end of my presentation, this is what we're going to find at the end. So how did countries, I'm going to use a regression discontinuity design, which I'm going to explain in detail in a second. So our impacts here are really relevant to countries that are near the eligibility thresholds for Gavi. I'll explain what that means, but how did those countries use Gavi vaccines? So the height of these bars represents the amount of aid you got, the total height of the bar. So in the first one, hepatitis B, the average Gavi eligible country got year in, year out, from 2000 to 2012, 11 actually, I believe, enough Hep B vaccines from Gavi to vaccinate 60% of infants. They got a lot of vaccines from Gavi, and they got enough to vaccinate 35% against DPT and 30-something% against Hib, and then Rota and Pneumo are these newer, as you move right, these are newer and more expensive vaccines. We have the dark blue bars are our estimate of causal impact. How much did Gavi raise vaccination rates? So of those vaccines, Hep B, they got a lot of vaccines, and we estimate the vaccination rates only went up by kind of single-digit percentages, which are not statistically significant. Same for DPT. For Hib, and while it doesn't really jump out at you there in the graph, we start to find significant effects, significant causal impacts, positive effects on vaccination for the newer vaccines to the right. Most, for the older generation, cheaper vaccines like Hep B and DPT, what we're going to claim is that most of the vaccines that were given probably went into kids' arms or butts or what have you, were not wasted, but displaced vaccination that would have happened anyway in otherwise identical countries on the other side of the threshold. So that's what I'll try to convince you of in the time I have remaining. All right, so let's talk about the econometric strategy, the quote-unquote natural experiment here, regression discontinuity. These are the 77 countries. I can justify being at the CSAE. A lot of them are in Africa, but not all of them around the world. China and India are both at some points Gavi eligible and receiving Gavi aid. For the sake of time, let's not actually show you the econometrics. Let's just show you by way of graphs. So Gavi was founded, began distributing in 2001, kind of founded in 2000, and set its eligibility criteria very explicitly that your baseline GNI per capita had to be below $1,000 in 1998. That's not PPP, that's 1,000 US dollars at exchange rates, at market exchange rates in 1998. And if you look at the data, you can see that compliance was not perfect, but they adhered pretty well to that rule. So if you're below 1,000, you've got about an 85, this is in any given country, year, cell, you've got about an 85% chance of getting Gavi aid if you're below that threshold. And if you move just above that threshold, you're jumping down to about 20%. So a huge cutoff there. And this is effectively our natural experiment in one slide, comparing people on one side of that cutoff to the other, assuming that any impact of GNI, which would certainly be there and certainly be strong, there's going to be a strong effect of wealth on vaccination rates, but in as much as wealth affects vaccination rates, GNI affects vaccination rates, that is determined by a smooth function, which shouldn't have any other reason to jump at $1,000. Okay, if you want to put that in some of the later slides, I'll do things in terms of a dose response model that looks at how much aid you got. What are we talking about in terms of how much? About $7 at the threshold, about $7 per infant per year on the treatment side. Okay, This, maybe for this audience, is probably less important, but sometimes I present this in front of audiences that are really not down with the regression discontinuity design, so we have a, real, as if there were two countries in the world, two not so randomly chosen countries, Ukraine and Philippines, happen to be just on either side of the $1,000 cutoff. In 1998 GNI, one's at 980, one's at 1,050. Vaccination rates, this is for Hep B in 2000, are both very low. True to its rules, in 2004, it took a couple of years for them to really get rolling, but by 2004, Ukraine gets enough Hep B from Gavi to vaccinate 81% of kids, and the Philippines gets nothing. Come back in the next year, and Ukraine's Hep B vaccination rate has shot up to 97%. So if you were doing a first difference, it would look really good, but even doing kind of the diff and diff, compared to the Philippines, went up to 49. We measure the impact just as the horizontal difference there. This is all cross-sectional, just to annoy Marcus sitting in the front row. This is all going to be cross-sectional. And the gap between those two things is going to be 48%. That's our measure of impact. That, in a stylized example, is kind of what we're doing here. Okay, so I'm dividing the talk between these cheaper, older vaccines, where our results are kind of disappointing, and the newer, more expensive vaccines, where things are going to be a little bit cheerier. So first, the cheap old vaccines. That's all the country year data points. Vaccination rates, percentage of infants that are vaccinated on the vertical axis. This is WHO data. WHO collects estimates from countries. It adjusts them to keep them in line so they don't deviate too far from the DHS survey data numbers, but they are producing, and you can be wary, there's reason to be wary, they're producing a vaccination rate for every country every year, largely based on administrative data, but using the survey data when they have it available. Group those into kind of arbitrary cells and fit a line through those on each side, and so the impact there is going to be how much does Hep B vaccination jump at that threshold? Not much. What we want to see is a jump up when you move down the income axis, remember, because you become eligible for Gavi. Nothing significant for hepatitis B. DPT, billions of dollars put into hepatitis B and DPT vaccinations. At the threshold, again, we see nothing there. And then as sort of a placebo test, measles, also an important vaccine, but something that Gavi did not directly fund. Fittingly, we see no effect there as well. Okay, so far, absence of evidence is not, evidence of absence. I've shown you that things didn't work. Can I really say that it didn't work, or just that I didn't find it? So let's look at the question of fungibility. Can I find a null hypothesis that I can reject? So back to our stylized example. How do we measure fungibility? Well, Ukraine, in this little example, got enough Hep B vaccination to vaccinate 81% of kids. We measured its impact at 48%. So we're going to define fungibility, or the combination of fungibility and waste, really, as 33%. Take the 81, they got 81%, it only went up by 48%, the remainder, something else happened. So that fungibility is what we call the 33%. The waste we're going to be fairly conservative about. We're only going to claim evidence of waste if the amount of aid you got is larger than the vaccination rate in your country. So for some countries, you will see them getting, say, enough vaccines to vaccinate 80% of kids, but only 60% of kids are vaccinated. The 20% clearly didn't go into anybody's arm, so that's pure waste. To do this econometrically, basically we take your vaccination rate, the same graph I showed you, and deduct the amount of Gavi aid you got from each point. So if you hadn't gotten Gavi, if we assume that Gavi has kind of a one-for-one impact and you hadn't gotten Gavi, we'd be down on the red lines. And here we do see this discontinuity. So the jump in the red lines there is equivalent to that 33% that I showed you before. That disconnect is what we're calling the displacement effect of Gavi, or the fungibility result. We get significant fungibility for Hep B, for DPT, and fittingly, measles, you didn't get any aid, you don't get any fungibility, just a sanity check. Okay. Waste, I'm running out of time, so very briefly, I just explained how we measure waste. On the x-axis, Gavi, how much aid you got. On the y-axis, the vaccination rate. the end of the arrow is like a scatter plot. So if you're over here in the southeast quadrant, it means you're getting more aid than you're vaccinating kids like Chad and the Central African Republic. And that vertical distance between the arrow end and the 45-degree line is a measure of how much of the aid is mysteriously disappeared. It looks like a lot on that graph. I don't have a graph that does it justice. When you average this across all the countries and all the years, actually the total waste amount ends up being actually quite trivial. So this, I need a graph that conveys that impression better, but total waste amounts end up being quite small. Okay. Running out of time, it would be unfortunate if I didn't show you any of the good news, so let's look briefly at the vaccines, the newer vaccines, more expensive vaccines, things that countries weren't necessarily already going to be doing on their own without Gavi aid, and we start to see, it's not, I'm not going to claim, if you look at the paper, we try lots of different specifications, linear and quadratic controls and different bandwidths, and this is not a slam dunk in terms of proving Gavi impact, but we do get some significant results for him, a significant increase in vaccination rates due to Gavi aid. We also, not in that specification clearly, but we can generate a few in the dose response model with a better IV. I can generate some significant results in rotavirus, nothing surprisingly for pneumococcal disease. Let me just jump, this will, for my own memory, you're not going to understand this, but what we will say is that for Hep B and DPT, we can't find any effect. We can reject no displacement and no fungibility. For the newer vaccines, Hib and Rota in particular, we find no evidence of fungibility, and we can't reject the null that Gavi aid increased vaccination rates 1-for-1. So we can't actually reject the best case scenario for the newer vaccines, except for pneumo. All right, so that is what I've been telling you since the start. A lot of distribution of these older, cheaper vaccines, Hep B and DPT. Most of that seems to be displacing things that would have been happening otherwise. Hib, much more positive results. Rota and Pneuma, it's really hard. They just haven't rolled out enough maybe to be able to for there to be enough variation in the data for us to do anything with in a cross-country RD design. What do we conclude? Kind of policy conclusions from all of this. I need to keep emphasizing, I haven't said enough times in the course of this 15 minutes, the regression discontinuity design produces a local average treatment effect, which is valid at the threshold. Our results are valid for countries at the threshold. So we, in the policy recommendations, divide this between the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries. Formally, I have nothing to say to you about the lower-income countries. I have no evidence about the impact of Gavi in these countries. I just put on the slide how much Gavi spending per child on each of these things: cheap vaccines, expensive vaccines, delivery network, and developing new vaccines. Our takeaway from this is like, we're big fans of Gavi, we're big fans of vaccinating children, let's do more of this. The one thing that we have evidence on that doesn't seem to be working is giving lower middle income countries free access to cheap vaccines. So really, our finding is about the upper right quadrant there. And if you wanted to talk about what should Gavi be doing going forward, the only thing that I think you could firmly read from our paper is maybe less of what's in the upper right quadrant there. Let me stop at that.
So thanks a lot. So I think it's a great paper on an important topic, given the size of Gavi's activities with a clear identification strategy. So the bad news is that you can't really reply to the question, is Gavi effective, given that you only find local effects. My main methodological concern is that you do not control for the bounded nature of the dependent variable. I think it should matter where you are in the vaccination rate distribution. So for example, for hepatitis B, where you will already have quite high levels, so it's really difficult to achieve impact. So I wonder whether you can somehow control for this. Maybe easy solution would be to split the sample in countries with low initial vaccination rates and countries with high initial vaccination rates, and in the end this might downward bias your results. because what you get here is just an average effect. But if you, in the end, want to reply to the question whether Gavi is effective, it would be interesting whether it has an effect on those countries with an initial low vaccination rate. So my next point is, so somehow, as a reader, you feel that somehow you want to find a good result. So we all somehow want to see that Gavi is effective in achieving something. So I think you should be careful how you interpret the insignificant result, because so I feel that sometimes they are treated as a zero effect, and sometimes as, oh, there could be something in there. And then I think, as a political economist, I think it would be interested in to learn a bit more in which cases Gavi strictly sticks to the cutoff, to the $1,000 cutoff. So maybe at least you could discuss this. Is there any evidence for lobbying? Is it really an exogenous decision? Do donor interests matter? And then when you have the discussion about waste, again, we have just an average effect, so I think it would be interested to learn a bit more about whether there's a pattern, who is more likely to waste. So in particular, when it comes later to your policy conclusions, if you can tell us a bit more, which countries are more likely to waste, and maybe you can also propose another form how to improve the way Gavi provides aid. And final suggestion is maybe you could devote a bit more time in explaining the differences between vaccines. So are these only a result of the differences in initial vaccination rates, or is there something else going on? So yeah, thanks.
Should I start, because I have the mic? Yeah, very interesting paper. Thank you very much for that. I was just wondering, so you find that there is a big effect in terms of fungibility. I'm wondering how much Gavi represents in terms of spending for the countries. Is it a big share of the health budget of the countries? And if so, could you see any effect on health budget of countries? Basically, because countries don't have to spend this money on vaccine, can they keep some of the money to spend on some other health services, or do they use this money to spend on other public services, or do they raise less taxes? How far can you go to see what is the impact of fungibility on the governmental budget and on health budget?
Yes, I have a question about your policy recommendation. So, if I understood well, you recommend that Gavi puts more effort into bringing these expensive vaccines to lower middle-income countries, or did I get it right?
I think the only thing strictly we can say is that giving cheap vaccines to middle-income countries has not achieved much.
Okay, so, but if then the alternative would be to give these more expensive and newer vaccines, then I would like to know who makes that decision. Is it Gavi, the supplier, or is it on demand by the receiving countries, for instance? Who decides which vaccines are being delivered? Also, this recommendation depends a bit on the benefits that you presented, but what about the costs? So you say that these vaccines are more expensive. If you would take into account this cost side, would you still have the same policy recommendation?
So I'm concerned that these aren't exactly IID, right? If you're the Philippines, you have a pretty good case coming to a donor and saying, come on guys, look, we're just above the cutoff, and so we're not eligible for these Gavi vaccines. Can you help us out? We really need this. And I'm wondering if third-party donors might be coming and helping them out. And the Gavi cutoff gives a particularly strong rationale, in which case the fungibility that you're seeing isn't these countries reallocating things in their own budget, but the fact that different donors are going to target different sets of countries. And so Gavi is targeting these guys at the bottom, but then other guys are going to pick up the slack, in which case all of them could be having a pretty big impact, but you're not going to see much above and below the cutoff.
Down here, maybe? Sorry to make you run, Julie.
Hello, hi. So when you say that there is a waste of vaccine, do you think that that's an indication of excess supply or just poor targeting?
So really quickly, just related to the previous question, do you have evidence of non-manipulation of the running variable?
Sorry, say that again?
The non-manipulation of the running variable, the McCrory paper. Now, there is a problem if there is this bunching, just...
the distribution of the running variable?
I'm not sure it's the case, but it would be good to see the distribution.
Yep. Okay. Okay, maybe I should take some of these in reverse order so I don't forget. We can run the McCrary type test and make sure, there are some recent papers on manipulation of national accounts data for aid purposes. We don't see any sign of that happening with Gavi, but you're right, I should have it in there, and I don't. Yeah, working backwards. Waste, is it excess supply or poor targeting? I don't think I can answer that. I think our default assumption has been probably excess supply. In some cases, you might be getting more physical vaccines than the extent of your vaccine delivery network. I think the most, methodologically threatening comment is the one in the back here about whether other donors, obviously you could create the impression of zero impact of Gavi if there's another donor that is the anti-Gavi, which has a eligibility threshold, which is the perfect inverse of Gavi, and we just don't measure that. So we have tried to do a little as best we can with IDA, and in Latin America, PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, does some bulk purchase of vaccines. We can kind of control for those things. It's not a perfect solution to that. We need to keep working on that to make sure there's not some compensating aid allocation there. In some sense, econometrically, the result would still be true. It would just be sort of, I think, trivial in a policy sense if that was what was driving the non-result. Ignoring the cost when pushing the expensive vaccine, our line is about, you're spending a lot of money on the cheap vaccines in middle-income countries and not achieving anything. Maybe look more to the pneumo, the rota, the newer I keep calling them expensive vaccines as shorthand. I'm clearly not a immunologist. One of my co-authors would object strongly just on the value from winning grounds of promoting anything on the basis of it being expensive. So I think the expensive vaccines are not necessarily bad value for money if you look at the mortality rates for the kinds of things that the pneumococcal vaccine or whatever could prevent. We haven't done probably enough analysis to, it would be back of the envelope, but we could do a little bit more with that. It's sort of an easy back of the envelope calculation when the denominator is 0 for the impact of the cheap vaccines in the middle income countries. But point taken, we could work more on that. I think multiple people have asked us in the past, and we're still working on a good answer. Can we see, if there's fungibility here, and one of the null hypotheses that we can reject is that there's no fungibility. There's clearly, less vaccination on Hep B and DPT than there should be if they were translating all of this aid into extra vaccinations. But then what does that do? In terms of freeing up resources, does that allow countries to spend that health money on something else? And can we pick up where that money goes? We've spent a lot of time playing with, so there is data on countries' own spending on vaccination and overall health budgets. If anybody here has ever worked with cross-country health budget data, it's pretty ropey, and I can't necessarily produce, anything. So I don't put a lot of, if somebody gives me a good idea for how to answer that question and somewhere to look for where the money might have gone, I'm kind of curious, but I don't have a lot of faith in the national budget data on health to pick up where those resources might have been redirected, where the fungibility went. Just picking and choosing now. On this, I think the first comment's from Andreas about the discussion. It's sad that we can't say anything about the impact of Gavi on the poorest countries. It would be nice if we had a research design that allowed us to say, what has Niger gotten out of Gavi? That's certainly true. I think there is a specific kind of policy relevance for what we're doing, and that one of the policy conversations right now at Gavi is around the graduation policies and where to draw that line and how much money to be putting into the countries near the threshold and the portfolio of vaccines. And so the nice thing about the paper is, as luck would have it, we are clearly in the case of, searching for your keys under the lamppost or whatever. This is what the RD design gave us, is the ability to talk about impacts at the threshold, but the threshold is one of the policy levers that's up for debate. So in that sense, I think there's a nice fit here. Maybe let me stop there. I think I've taken more than my allocation of time. But thank you to all 4 of the presenters and discussants and to everybody for your questions. We're fast. It was the women. You guys were both very fast. Andreas and I think we're on time.